So we're going to spend some time talking about intentional communication, and this is really a very key, not quite a stage of a development, but a behavior that develops in the first year of life, and it really provides the foundation for all kinds of communicative exchanges. It provides the roots of everything that happens in terms of conversations in the future and so on. And so let's begin just talking about what these different stages of language development are. And so when we're talking about the perlocutionary stage of development, really what we're talking about behaviors in the stage, the preverbal stage, are really reflexive. So in this stage, caregivers are assigning intentionality. So when a baby is crying, parents are determining that it's a situation of a hunger or sleepy or wet pants or whatever it may be. Positive behaviors like a smile, parents are also interpreting as reflecting the baby's really happy or they like a toy. And so all of this intentionality means that parents are assigning ideas that the children are really doing something in a purposeful way. And even though parents don't really believe this at a foundational level, they're constantly assigning these intentionality to all of these behaviors. When children transition to the elocutionary stage, this is really where we start to see true intentional communication. This is when we begin to see babies having words, and in this stage, they are producing behaviors that are goal-directed to influence someone else's behavior. So they have that understanding that something that they do can affect change on someone in their environment. And so this is when we start to see babies, really now we're talking about infants and toddlers. Not infants, talking about older infants and toddlers, really doing things like starting to point to things, to show, to reach for items, vocalizing to communicate wants and needs, oftentimes pairing gestures and vocalizations. And so when children reach this elocutionary stage of development, now they're doing things that are intentional, that we can assign intentionality to based on our interpretation of what they're wanting to communicate. So we know that there's something that's purposeful that's happening, and so adults are still assigning some of the intention to it, trying to determine exactly what that intention is. And the locutionary stage is when children actually start to use words. So when we think about intentionality, again, children are learning that their behaviors have an effect on another, and they're creating some sort of a signal, whether that's a vocalization or, like we talked about, a gesture, a point, a reaching, a showing, and they're expecting that they can have effect on a caregiver. This usually emerges around 8 to 10 months of age. And again, although parents have been assigning intentional behavior from the beginning, this is when truly intentionality occurs. So we know that 9 months old can follow a maternal point, which is a developmental hallmark as well. Not that I'm comparing children to dogs, but it's something that an animal can't do. If you want your dog to go and fetch something, you can try it. If you point to something across a room, a dog isn't able to follow your line of regard, and so they don't have that mental representation of intentionality. But by 9 months of age, children do. And then by around 12 months of age, we know that infants start to look at parents when they're starting to vocalize, meaning that they're really making associations between what they're doing vocally and how their parent can respond to their needs. So there's a few things that we need to see in place to determine that something is truly intentional. And this becomes one of our roles as we're working with young children and analyzing their early communicative development, is determine what a child is doing to determine whether it truly is intentional or not. And here's some sort of guiding principles to that underlie the idea of communicative intent. One is that the child is making eye contact while gesturing or vocalizing, and often will look between the adult and the object of interest. So really establishing that shared reference, that joint reference. We see that the gestures and vocalizations that they're producing become more consistent and ritualized. If we think about that point, for example, that's something that's consistent and is done in a really consistent environment, consistent response, a consistent direction to parent. We see that after a child gestures or vocalizes, we often see them waiting for a response. So again, they're intentional. They know that they're trying to affect the change of someone else. They're vocalizing, pointing. They're looking at the parent, looking back to the cup of milk that they have on the counter, and they'll wait for their parent or the adult in their environment to do something. So there's an expectation that the adult is going to do something. And then the other piece, knowing that it's intentional, is that oftentimes when children are communicating intentionally, they are persistent in their effort. And so it's not just a random point to look at a parent and then moving on, but there's something that they truly want to communicate about. So the questions that you can ask yourself in determining intentionality, which is something you'll do for your toddler observation, is first, if the child is trying to direct the adult's behavior in an observable way, what is it that they're trying to gain from the adult? You look to see whether the child is making eye contact with the adult and the object in the situation. So are they establishing that joint reference or that joint attention? Are they communicating that with a gesture and or vocalization? And certainly when kids move into words, clearly words are intentional in terms of their communicative effort. But so we're not saying that it's only gestures or vocalizations that intentionality. This is just the stage that the child is at this point. And then the last question is whether they persist if they're not understood. Do they work hard to get their point across? I've shared a couple of examples of communicative intent, so you can copy those and take a look at them. Those are also in your notes. And when children are very early on or communicating, there's just a couple of kinds of things that they communicate about early on. So some sort of a rejection, that they're wanting to terminate an interaction, that may be a turning away, that may be throwing something on the floor, for example. But again, this is something that's not reflective. This is the idea that the child is purposely trying to terminate that something that's happening. It may be a vocalization. Maybe the adult is playing some sort of a bouncing game with them, and the child starts to vocalize kind of a protesting sound and is looking at the adult. So it's clear that rejection, the intentionality is clear. The child may be requesting, meaning that they're trying to obtain something from the adult. That could be a social interaction. That could be an object. That could be an action. That could be, wanting a cup of milk on the counter. That could be wanting the parent to continue to bounce them in like a horseshoe-like fashion on their knee. Anything that is asking for something is a request. And that last one early on is commenting, which is used to direct a partner's attentions for the purpose of just jointly noticing an object. And this is one we really keep a close eye on in terms of emergence, because unlike the other two where the child gets something directly related to them, commenting is really used just for the social exchange of it. And so one of the things that we see, again, with children with autism, that sometimes we'll see those requesting behaviors emerge in terms of intentionality, but we don't see that commenting behavior intentionality emerge early on. And part of that is that because of the social communication deficit, they're not interested in establishing that joint reference and that joint attention just for the purpose of sharing that with an adult in their environment. They do not have that social drive for that social communication. And in your notes, you'll see information related to some different ways that we can analyze the early pragmatic functions of a child. So remember, this would fall under this broader category of pragmatic language, or some of that pragmatic language being behaviors like the turn taking that's occurring early on, and the other aspect of pragmatic language being the function that these different behaviors are serving. And so, for example, labeling, the child is using a word to make reference to something in the environment. Repeating is a behavior where the child is repeating something that the adult says. Answering is answering a question or providing some sort of information. Requesting action and requesting just in general, like an object. Those things are a little bit more inherent. Calling is a word or words that's used to obtain another's attention, and all of these are in your notes in your that are posted online on our website. Greeting when a child may call hello or goodbye in terms of a communicative interaction. Protesting reflects that idea of rejection as well, but it's something that communicates some sort of a dislike or disapproval of something, not interested in either continuing or not wanting to receive something the adult is offering. And then practicing, the idea with practicing is that the child may be just, they call it kind of a catch-all category. A child may be just playing by themselves and just repeating a word over and over. So sometimes when we don't have that information about, understanding what the child is doing, that can be a practicing behavior. And then your text talks about early intentionality from Ray Kent's perspective. He's just another researcher and theoretical commentator in language in the area of speech and language, a super well-known researcher from the University of Wisconsin. And so he builds upon some of those. You'll see that different, you can have different theorists or different researchers talk about some of these pragmatic functions in different ways. I like to share Doerr's pragmatic functions because I feel like it's one of the more common ones that's used, and I feel like it's pretty useful, but I just wanted to call your attention to a couple of other potentially pragmatic functions. Ray Kent talks about the idea of attention seeking to self, where the child is just willing to try to get the adult's attention to events, and that sort of reflects that idea of joint attention. Aligning with the idea of labeling in some way, but when maybe a child is not using a verbal word is how they talk about it. Informing, which would align with this idea of commenting in terms of Doerr's pragmatic functions. And then he also talks about this idea of transferring, which is giving an object that they're playing with to another person. So when one of the activities you'll be asked to do is to take a look at some toddlers in terms of their communicative exchanges and trying to identify what kind of pragmatic intent they are communicating using gestures and vocalizations. And one of the things we're looking for as speech language pathologists is really making sense that a child is communicating intentionally and looking at the kind of diversity of intentional communication that they have. So if you have a child who is communicating intentionally, but the only thing they're ever doing is requesting, that may become a concern depending on the child's age, because we see some of these, we expect more diverse pragmatic functions emerging as the child gets older. And just a really, really key area of evaluation and making sense of typical development for children in this late infant into early toddler age. So that's the end of our conversation related to intentionality. And I just added this last little blurb for fun. You guys have probably seen it before, but it's just a couple of twins interacting. And even though it's unclear whether there's something truly intentional in terms of their exchange, given the diversity of the prosody, intentionality, and pitch and intensity and so on, it sure sounds like they're trying to tell each other something. So definitely let me know if you have questions.